Hello, everyone. I am Heidi Reitmaier, the Deputy Director, and Richard and Elizabeth Currie, Chief of Education and Programs. I would like to acknowledge that this land is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral, and Seneca Nations. I have a great pleasure today of welcoming Anna Cutler, the Director of Learning and Research at Tate, and Wendy Woon, the Edward John Noble Foundation Deputy Director for Education at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Today, we're starting our series, Shape of the Museum. In this series, the AGO team will be inviting their colleagues from across the world to talk about the work inside the museums and cultural institutions at this pivotal moment. So I want to thank Wendy and Anna for joining us today for the first of our series. And this is completely selfish, really inviting them here today, because I know their work has really changed how we understand learning and programs. Their work has been instrumental in changing how we work inside museums with artists, with practitioners, and the public to build dialogues and opportunities for connecting art, society, and the broader issues that we face today. And what better time really to look at that in this pivotal moment, to think about how we're gonna go back, how we're doing our work now, how we're gonna go back to work, and how we're impacting and working with our audiences. So I thought it might be prudent to start this conversation really with a question that solicits a brief introduction from both of you to really describe your jobs, which sounds mundane perhaps, but I think to begin to understand what it is that you do and what impact we have in how the museum shapes itself with our visitors, our audiences. So Anna?
So I'm the Director of Learning. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm the Director of Learning and Research at Tate, and what I understand my job to be, although it changes on a daily basis, to be quite honest, is a kind of a facilitator, or often a dot joiner between the invitation that we make to our public for art to enable you to think differently. And what I see my role as being really is someone who enables that to happen, so that we find ways of inviting forms of engagement that enable people to think differently, and to invite ourselves to look at different ways that art shapes and communicates and might make us think critically about who we are in the world. So that's the sort of, that's my job, and that's what I think I'm sort of trying to enable. What that means is a lot of meetings, a lot of persuasion, debate, finding out what other people do. I think it's about developing a vision with my team and then holding that, and being able to kind of connect in and out of the institution about what that vision is. So somebody actually called me what do they call me? A principled pragmatist, and I wasn't sure whether I like that or not. But I think that actually what we're trying to do is to hold on to an idea and to give that space to breathe in the museum. And I think that therefore there's a responsibility to be thinking across the piece, to know what's going on in the world, to try to shape things up, and probably to really back off and let my team get on and be as brilliant as they are, and just support them so they don't have to worry about the stuff. I will try to worry about the stuff and give them space to experiment, take risks, and be supported, really. So that's sort of in a nutshell.
Wendy, do you want to?
Sure. I'd probably say that I'm a public advocate within the institution, trying to make the importance of art in people's lives much more visible and valued. And, you know, part of it's modeling different kinds of behaviors within the institution, of really continuing to question what barriers we might create for people. And challenging. I'd say that sometimes I'm a bit of a troublemaker in a good sense, to try and really expand people, get people to think more about the public, more about why art matters. And I would say that, you know, from the beginning, my goal has always been to try and put, MoMA's a fairly hierarchical institution, and you know, to try and actually re-embrace the founding history of the museum, which is as an educational institution. The other thing is also to try and help people understand that not everyone is an educator, but that education and getting, you know, really thinking about people's needs first, who's coming, who's not coming, and why art should be more accessible to a larger number of people is sort of really key to what I'm trying to achieve, is really, you know, helping people expand the notion of what education is. There's often this very kind of traditional idea of education is about delivery, and complicating the ideas of what education can be. And within my own team, it's, you know, to me, it's about creating culture. So it's creating a culture within of great collaborators, great leaders and facilitators, that you kind of give them, you know, some guidance, but also permission to experiment, and also to really think of themselves as researchers, really constantly learning and challenging themselves to think about, you know, whether what you're doing is really what helps people or what's really relevant at this moment in time. So those are sort of the things that I think about most.
Can I then ask you both to take that idea of a public advocate, take that idea of a facilitator, as you're both describing it, and that's the kind of internal work that we do, but flipping that and thinking about its relationship to the greater ecosystem of the museum and what the museum's job is. So thinking through, what do you both think the museum's job is in our world today? And then I might ask you how that could potentially shift in light of COVID. So maybe Wendy, if you want to keep speaking through that idea, what is the museum's job?
Well, I really feel like it's, I mean, the objects are one thing, and we, you know, I think in the past, people have seen the objects as the most important thing. We would talk about ourselves a lot, and instead of talking about what we do in the world. And I think really recognizing that, I always love Luis Comensur always says that the artwork is just a carcass, and you know, it's kind of a, you know, an interesting way to think about, you know, that actually these things exist because they were made by people through a process of responding to a particular time in the world and different kinds of situations. And it's always that sort of humanity that we're trying to help people connect with and build from. So that actually a museum should be a generative space that isn't a repository, but it's actually not about itself, it's about what people are creating and drawing from this and doing something new with in their own lives. And so that to me is that's the dynamic that I find that keeps me going. And that kind of infinite curiosity. So it's really, and I think for the future, I think if we don't really, I think, you know, people will be bereaved. They will, social isolation has a huge impact on health and well-being. And, you know, it's a lot of people will feel pretty traumatized by what has gone on. And, you know, how we can bring people together safely, how we can actually start to rethink our role. It's sort of interesting. I wrote a little article about, because we just reopened, and before we reopened, the museum was shut down, and I was walking with a curatorial fellow, and this person said, "Oh, isn't this great? There's no one here because we just shut down." And I said, "Actually, no, I don't think it's great. I think it's actually kind of sad, and because what makes this place is actually the people." And now I feel like there's going to be this another moment where right now when people walk through, they say it feels really sad and it feels really empty and it's like a shell. And so to me, now the focus on bringing audiences back, even in tiny bits, so that they're not, we have so many widgets of people that are coming in that actually support our budget. It's actually like, we really want this to be meaningful to people. We really want to think about them and their needs, their safety, their comfort, and what, really understand what art might do at this moment in time. And so to me, it's a really interesting moment.
Anna, do you want to think about or just respond to that idea of the museum's job?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's changed, and I think that actually, if you asked different people within the museum, they would probably have different responses to this. But I was thinking the other day that, from the Victorian times, which were sort of set out to educate and be good for you, and that actually that was something that would improve you, and so the objects became the form of education. And now, in my experience, is that the museum has become the object of education. That actually the whole museum is under scrutiny for our publics about what its role is, how it's operated, what it means, but not in a negative way at all. I think in a very exciting way, the kind of the understanding of the construct of the museum and what it could be and what it is has dawned on people and made them feel very active and energetic about wanting to explore what that means. What does collecting an object mean, on whose behalf, representing who, and I think those are all fantastic questions that art, of course, addresses and invites. So I think there's, for me, there's quite an interesting rub at the moment where people both want to be more expansive and very much as Wendy says, that there's a kind of, that the people are there's a realization that people are making this and generating meaning, and without them, there's not a lot going on in there. But that also there are still some complications around, how we move from still understanding the object and what the relationship to that is, with taking ourselves beyond that. And not to say that those things aren't important. What do we want to take forwards in the world as ideas, so I think it's actually a really incredible time, and I think its job is changing. I think it depends who you are and where you are and what your role is. So there are some museums where they're very embedded in their communities, and that is part and parcel of it. And I was wondering about this ourselves, because often we have our local can be international, and we have then the hyperlocal of wherever our museums are. But I think it does invite, this moment certainly invites us to really interrogate that with the public.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that criticality is what's very dynamic right now, that people are questioning what the museum should be. We did a project with teens a couple of years ago with Adelita Husni-Bey, called The Council, and she worked with teens to think about what a post-apocalyptic museum would be like, and they came up with 4 ideas, and one of them was really about well-being. If you don't have a collection, what value does a museum, what use does a museum have in society? And so what's interesting is she's firing up the conversation again at this moment, because it seems like a really prescient time to kind of think about what a museum should be, and in a post-pandemic era.
I think there's what I'm hearing from both of you, which is very interesting, is I wouldn't say a tension between the object and our work within communities, but a question in a sense of, we know the objects are very central to the institutions that we work in, but we also know our communities and audiences are very central. So can you talk a little bit about, I wouldn't say that facilitation, but how those conversations happen to produce new types of learning for audiences that wouldn't happen in other places, like the uniqueness of the spaces we work in. So Anna, do you want to?
Wendy?
Well, you know, I'm just going to talk, maybe this will relate to it. I keep thinking about, you know, the role of the artist. And I think, you know, institutions have been so focused on their collections that it's more, and more, right? More space, more, you know, expansions. And I'm kind of in a Maria Kondo phase of my life right now. It's like, how much more do you really need? And how much energy and budget do you need to spend on maintaining all of these things that most people don't see, or they, you know, 2% of collections are on view. And also in a visit, when it becomes like so taxing to actually physically spend an entire day at a museum, there's only so much you can take in. And when we do our research, it's like the first few rooms people spend time, and then it's almost like, where's the, you know, how much longer does this go on? Because we can't take in that much information. And what I'm thinking and more about when we ask people what they really want to know most about the art is artist inspiration and materials and processes. And I think that actually artists and learning have a wonderful parallel of being not about a thing or an endpoint, but about a process. And so actually bringing people into the process of creating, that was sort of the whole idea behind the Creativity Lab and the People Studio that we opened when we reopened, was actually it gave people a time to process by doing and making. Because it becomes overwhelming, and they would start to really kind of slow down, think about what they'd seen, think about what that meant, and brought their own experience to it as well. So for me, I think, you know, a shift back to, you know, the artist rather than the object humanizes it for people, and also, you know, parallels the learning process in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think, Wendy, that it's probably similar, that we have always worked with artists in learning programs. Mm-hmm. And the reason we've done that is very much because their process speaks to A, the process of learning, and B, the connection with what we're looking at. So they, you know, not all of them, obviously, but those that have an interest in learning, I think are fantastic exemplifiers of creative learning, who are there to not create or orthodoxy, but are there to create novelty. And that's about novelty in thinking, and, you know, opportunities for people to come across the new. And I think what we do, and I think what people who are very skilled in this do, is create those environments in which those forms of engagement are really considered and really well framed. But I think they might be very different, you know. So for us, Tate Exchange is a very different learning environment mm-hmm. than some of the kind of more guided tours or experiences you might have. I'm personally, I enjoy that much more eclectic learning, and I like to do it myself. Although actually I've noticed that as I've got older, I'm much happier to just receive these days. So I'm interested, and I know that my colleagues are really interested in, you know, what, you know, I use that little formula, which is it's pretty tongue-in-cheek, but it is about space, time, content, and method, given your context. And so mm-hmm. what do you do with space, time, content, and method that generate forms of deliberate opportunities for learning, as you say, absolutely as a process that will consider many aspects, and what's the fine-tuning about those that needs to happen to be most generative for people?
Yeah, I think the other thing is that art historians tend to focus just on artists as producers of objects. And I think that a much more expanded view of what an artist is. I mean, most of the artists do teach and, you know, have been amazing at actually fostering generations of the next artists that, you know, have works in exhibitions and break new ground. And so I think that what I'd love to see is a greater and more expansive notion of who is an artist, and who can make, and how we can value that. And I also, you know, sort of one of the things I love is to ensure that people's work can actually be seen within the museum as well. So, which is, I think, has been taboo in some places, but to really put it front and center, that what people bring to the museum, what their knowledge and experience is, isn't less, it's just different. And so how we can really celebrate that as well.
Yeah, have you, I mean, I have noticed, I mean, perhaps it's because it's what we're doing differently, but the significant amount of people who want to make and talk is really, you know, we all think it, but actually to see it is quite staggering.
Yep.
So, you know, that people's need to
Yep.
to make a mark or to create,
Yeah.
and to be seen. I mean, what a lot of people say in Tate Exchange is to be visible. You know, value and visibility are huge, and I think it speaks really quite sadly probably about our societies at the moment, but it's one of the few civic spaces that still exist for people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, what I love about the Tate Exchange is it really, I mean, you can get a cup of tea. I mean, isn't that thoughtful? You know, the idea of creating a space that is so thoughtfully conceived that people feel comfortable and welcome. They're open to meeting new people and having different kinds of conversations that they might not have had before, and, you know, that they come back time and time again. A lot of the research that we were doing in the space before we closed was basically 98% of people said it actually added value to a visit. So, and the length of time was significant considering how much people spend in the museum as a whole. So in our early experiments, we found in one of the studios, people spent 54 minutes on average, and on the whole fourth floor of the museum, the average was 14 minutes. So, you know, how you process and, you know, how you, what kinds of experiences you want to create that are memorable and generative are, you know, something that we're thinking about a lot.
You both talked about, I think it's very interesting because this idea of creating generative spaces, and just to catch those that are watching or listening to us, both of you have very actively, in shaping Tate Modern and shaping the reopening of MoMA, created these, if you like, civic spaces, these new public spaces. And these aren't sort of traditional making spaces in that way. They are a sense of a kind of civic space where there's a democratization, where you're opening up process. And Wendy's point, increasing the value for our audiences, understanding that these are really treasured moments. Can you talk a little as well about how that sense of the generative is now really instrumental to the way we're thinking or opening up museums? Can you talk a bit more about that democratization that you're both alluding to? Does that make sense?
I mean, I think Tate Exchange does it really well because it, you know, it really invites people in, you know, to take, you know, to kind of do their thing, and it sort of brings other expertise to the table, and values it and makes it visible. You know, I think institutionally, you know, MoMA's a different kind of institution. It's not a national, it's not free, it's, you know, so for us, for me, I think, and for our team, trying to make visible you know, why people, you know, having a broader audience is really important. And sometimes, I mean, for me, it's the storytelling of that. So the more documentation we have, the more that we can tell these great stories of what people actually find value in, and what it generates for them is that's kind of, that's how we're starting to move the needle on some of that.
Anna, do you want to talk a little to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a complicated thing because, you know, there's a real, and I understand it and recognize it, but there's often a real desire for people within the museum to want to tell people what they've done and about things and how things are. So, but to have the kind of exchange that I think has real value for people and meaning, you really have to hold back and invite people to bring their own experiences and knowledge in. They're very different, and I think there's been a nervousness that kind of attitude would you know, get rid of the expert or disappear that knowledge, and it's completely not true. That actually people really value that knowledge, but they're coming with something different, and yeah, I actually saw it in sort of in action when we had a Tate Exchange where we were one day, they were just making tea houses out of cardboard. And so the students, and that was their project, so they just had flat cardboard everywhere, and people were just coming to Tate Exchange, and they were made part of the problem or the answer, which was, we need to make a tea house, can you help us? And of course, you know, one person happened to be an engineer and a builder. So we had this extraordinary tea house suddenly got made by one particular group. But the learning for those students who were art students was incredible. And I just thought, wow, you know, if we hadn't, that's an exchange that just would never have happened.
Yeah.
And what they said was, it's like being on a public street, being in Tate Exchange, in a good way, that you get seen, but people feel like they should say something to you, or they would comment, or they would make, and that's the invitation, which is, well, you tell us. And I do think that a bit of a shift to, well, you know, how is it for you? It is a needed thing, because we have plenty, you know, we have plenty of what we know it is for us. We have much less understanding of what others might want and feel.
Yeah,
I would agree with you on that. And I think that's where the facilitation, I mean, education is about facilitation. So it's about knowing what you know, but, you know, really pulling out the best from different people. And I think that's what the other thing is, really how we can build communities. And I was thinking about some of our early experiments with these studio spaces. I always remember there was a group of people that, and one woman said it actually saved her life that winter, that she was so depressed that it became the place that she went to on a regular basis. And so this group of people, this was years and years ago, got to know each other and actually continued to be friends. One of them actually had a camera stolen, and another one of the group made a set of prints and sold them and gave that other person the money to purchase a camera. So things like that. And then I'm going to take that one step further, is online courses. So one of the things I've been most interested in is we've been experimenting with online courses since 2010. Our first one was an art history, standard art history class, and the other one was kind of more of an experiment, which was a online art making class. And what came out of that is that there's a group of people that created their own, after they'd taken the courses, created their own Facebook groups and continue to be communities online and reach out to us. They come to visit us, and they connect all over the world. They meet up at different places. And when Hurricane Sandy came, they reached out to MoMA to see whether they could raise funds for artists in New York City. And I think, you know, those kinds of things, like how a museum can be this kind of meeting place, either digitally around the idea of the museum, around engagement with art, or physically in spaces where people feel that it's a place of, you know, a place that they feel comfortable in, that they can feel an ownership of, where they can bring their knowledge and experience and feel like they have been heard and it is valued, is important.
yeah. I have a great question here, which I thought actually follows on, Wendy, with what you just pointed out, which we were talking a little bit about access and earlier about authority. Within our departments, have we thought, or how does the discursive programming, the workshops, and the audience-led activations address the question around our colonial imperial history of our institutions? And really, what are the challenges or inversely possibilities of a digital education platform to decolonize or de-imperialize? So maybe take out even digital there and just say, like, what are our challenges and opportunities inside the institutions we work? So Anna, do you want to have, I mean, Tate is an evident.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's, you know, the whole concept of a museum is, you know, a colonial enterprise. So you're right in it, and of course there are, you know, well, there are lots of things about it. You know, can you know, Stuart Hall perspective, you can't decolonize. You're in it. We've been through it. So how do you rethink it? How do we acknowledge it? How do we recognize it? And then what changes do you want to make to address it? So I think we're probably at the very early stages, if I'm really honest, I think, at addressing it, at actually looking at what it means. We've got a project going on at the moment that we've started, just looking at different sort of taxonomies and just how things have been categorized as they've come in, and the language that gets used. And I'm particularly interested in language, and so much of what we do is so subsumed in language. So, you know, there is nothing that doesn't need to be considered in the great enterprise of looking at the kind of decolonized museum, you know, from language to what we collect, to how we choose to show it, to recognizing the perspectives of all of those things, including our attitudes and behaviors, they're all so radical, really. So, you know, we need to recognize and make it explicit, I think, to begin with, and then start to look at that. I think it's quite exciting, because I think, you know, it means that we will have an opportunity to rethink things and to be challenged and to challenge ourselves. So I think that I'm hoping that real good will come from this, in terms of really looking at why we do what we do, and why, and for whom we're doing this, and that actually we need to adapt and change to think about what are the narratives that have not been heard and continue not to be heard, which is, you know, one of the great resistances of white culture.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that in talking about how we change the culture within our institutions, and, you know, how we can actually, well, our team invited a number of other colleagues to do a 2-day anti-racism training together. And I think just starting that conversation about who isn't in the room, what our own personal biases are, is a good place to start, because, you know, it has to start from people who make decisions within institutions, or are the gatekeepers of who comes in and who's allowed to come in. So I think that a lot of it is really rooted in a deep questioning of ourselves as a starting point, you know, and how that plays out in language and labels and choices of what gets collected and doesn't get collected, or what gets invested in and doesn't get invested in, and then to, you know, continue to challenge that decision, the decision-making processes, which isn't always easy.
Yesterday, I was on a webinar learning about how to approach things with an equity mindset. And one of the points was to yours, Wendy, is how do you come knowing that you're embedded in the biases? Like, how do you come knowing with that openness, that understanding that we're all implicit? So to that point, I wanted to ask, there's another question here about how do you get staff who are not involved in necessarily vision making. So how do you, as museum professional, bring those voices to the fore and create inclusivity and collaboration? And then also, what is your, I guess, most successful moment where those voices or your audience voices are actually transformed some of the inner workings of the institution? Like, where have you seen success of something that you've initiated, and then actually it's come out where something has radically changed inside your institution because of the work that you've done?
I can give an example of that.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to use accessibility for people with disabilities as being something that when I first started at MoMA, we had wonderful programs, but we would always get these calls from the director's office of so-and-so's, can you answer this call? This person is complaining, da, 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 you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And I always used to say, you know, disability training should be required like sexual harassment training. Everybody should be invested in this. It's not the education department's responsibility. And so much of it is you can do programs, but if people come back on their own, then the museum doesn't really support that experience. But what was really amazing was the COO of the museum had a moment, and he actually, and he used to get some of these letters, and he basically realized it isn't just education, it's all of our responsibilities. And so he put together a task force that included, you know, even the restaurant, Danny Meyer changed, all the restaurants changed his hiring policies. You know, all totally remodeled their restrooms. And I think what it's done is, and Francesca Rosenberg has been a huge leader for that, I think it takes people who are committed to change and, you know, regularly pushing for that. And what we often will say is like, you know, you've done well when you're at a meeting and like the AV person is speaking up before you do about an exhibition issue, and how is that going to be accessible? So it's almost like there are all these deputies out there that become so invested in accessibility that they want to be a part of it, and they want to ensure that that vision is realized within the museum.
Anna?
So what was the first question?
The question was, how do you get staff who are not at the top kind of involved in vision making? And
yeah, so everybody should be involved in vision making. And, you know, I think that, and there are various different ways of doing it, but yeah, I always feel that there's a responsibility to kind of kick something off and then directly invite people to talk about it and write into it, quite literally write into the vision. And then we all look at it and decide what works and what doesn't. And what happened in terms of the entire institution this time with our new director was that we all did workshops about values and what we wanted to have as values. The entire institution did that. And that makes a huge difference, because then you are all on a journey together instead of on someone's journey that you may or may not want to be part of. And I think I really like the explicit nature of that, so that people can decide to not do it if they don't want to, or to explain their course within it, so that you can all change and do better. So I think I really think that people can and should be part of that vision making process as much as possible. Clearly you can't have 30 people all making a decision, because that all falls apart. 80 people around a table, but there has to be consensus, and there has to be, you know, at least to throw a stone and people to want to swim to it. You know, you need to know people want to swim there. And I think that's been one of the things that we might have brought to the table, which is that sense of how you can work with more people and get them involved, and that people do have a say and can have a say within the institution. And therefore, you know, people outside might have that some opportunity to make a shift. And I suppose, you know, one of the things that I would say is that we did a project with Tanya Bruguera where in Tate Exchange, and then we've called the building, we've called the Void House the Natalie Bell building, and she's a local community activist. And there's something about naming people and naming something that starts to shift people's perspective on where you are and what things mean within the institution. And I think we've also really cared about what kind of welcome happens in Tate Exchange, and that was definitely something that we've talked about, which is how do you recreate that for everyone in the museum? You know, how do we go about that? What does that look like? How, you know, what does a free cup of tea look like? how do you make something feel comfortable and available to people? So I don't know, I'm not sure I would use the word radical probably ever, but I do think there are small shifts and changes that move a culture that are really positive, and that you know, gradually we begin to tip things in a different way.
So I had, I'm just flagging up to everyone that the Q&A is open, and please do throw your questions. Kathleen McLean, who's part of our team, is diligently looking and responding and forwarding me any of those questions. I wanted to ask a bit about the values of the institution, because you brought this up, Anna, and actually it was a conversation that happened yesterday with some people. Is, can you quickly define the values of your institution as they're put forward, I guess, across the entire museum? And which ones do you think are most important now as you move forward?
So ours are open, bold, kind, and rigorous. And we all had an argument about rigorous, because lots of people hated it and lots of people loved it. But if we understand rigorous to be about really exploring and challenging ourselves and having self-criticality as much as, you know, any academic, you know, capacity, then I think that's really what it means. I think that actually all of those, you know, for me, openness comes with a sense of generosity, which I think we absolutely have to have right now. I think kindness is, again, there was some controversy around that and people not really liking that, but I think kindness is actually incredibly important right now. And I have seen extraordinary acts of kindness, actually. I think we probably want to talk about some of the politics that sit behind that, but I think that's a good thing. And I think we have to be quite bold in how we need to change things, because I think it's very clear that things are not going to be able to stay the same. So I think we're going to have to be bold in what we do moving forwards.
Wendy?
We don't actually have any values that are articulate or have been shared widely institutionally for the whole museum. They would probably default to things like collecting, preserving, scholarship, and education in a very traditional sense. But what I would say, well, the Department of Education has had core values since I started, and we just revised ours. And it was really a great process because we worked with a Columbia University business professor who has a kind of a, it's based on research. And so you actually start with your own personal values first, because research indicates that if you see your own values reflected in the institution's values, then you're more likely to, you know, kind of invest in them. And so we did our own values first, and there was kind of a trading, and there was an online part of it. It was great fun. And then we came to 5 values that were actually voted on and through a whole series of processes. So it was pretty democratic. And then there was a group that helped wordsmith the final ones that were people from different areas. So ours are empowerment, empathy, creativity, joy, and radicality. And radicality was actually debated, and it's still under debate, but in this moment, radicality seems like we need to really radically shift. And I think empathy is something that we need to really embrace, given that our audiences will be coming, if they come to the museum again, will be coming with you know, bereavement, trauma, isolation, fear, and how we can make them feel comfortable. And, you know, what has really stunned me, and I've been very excited about it, is in this moment, seeing how incredibly creative people are, what they're doing online, whether it's, you know, sourdough bread making, or just the variety of things that people are creating their own TV shows, and they're, you know, doing all kinds of demonstrations, but really having some fun and some joy in creating within their environments. So that to me has been the best part of what we can get out of this kind of difficult situation. I think joy is what we'd all like to see be more part of our lives again. And, you know, I don't know how long this will go on, but how we can find that joy again, I think is something perhaps a museum can help people come together and find that again.
I think, so I have another question about digital fatigue. Do we think, and then I had one more question to kind of bring us to a close, but do we think the public, this period will lead to digital fatigue on the part of the public and institutions collectively? Or do we think we're looking at a new era in which maybe the digital will play a part in the museum in a different way?
I love that question. And I can see that person just pushing the button now. Well, there has been what I would say a saturation. And we actively decided to not create a great load of new content because, you know, I think there was a sense that there was a lot out there. Personally, I would like us to see how we can use digital more inventively. I think that there are ways that we could use digital that we haven't. You know, this is a very traditional transmission model, and I know that we are really committed to trying to make and do things. So it's a very, you know, it doesn't necessarily do the things that we probably want it to do. But it has been unbelievably powerful at this moment, and it has been quite creative, or quite good at sharing creativity. I'm not sure it's implicitly done that. So I am up for seeing how we can push this and what we can do with digital that actually brings more life to it and is more creative.
Wendy?
Yeah, I yes, fatigue definitely. But what I find really interesting is how tactile the things people are doing at home are. And so they're sharing them digitally, but they're really about tactility and sensuality. And so to me, that's a really interesting blend that I'd like to learn more about. And I agree that more creatively using technology and thinking, I mean, I mean, since we started doing online courses and you know, sort of embracing, I always used to say digital by design. So as you're thinking of the analog, how are you doing this digitally, and can digital actually inform what you do analog and the other way around, so that research can kind of cross, because we don't live our lives in one silo or another. It's just all together, right? We're making sourdough and we're Zooming. Yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities. I'm excited. I think it'll be interesting.
I love how the conversations are unfolding, the kind of self-direct, how people are taking it upon themselves to share.
Mm-hmm.
And that in a way is something we kind of try to orchestrate inside institutions, inside the museum. And yet there's this whole sense of people just going out there and making and creating new relationships and sharing. So for me, it's like, how do we actually embrace that and incorporate that into the way we're moving forward? Yeah.
One thing I have noticed though is that we've made resources for local drops with the food drops for the people who have the least. And what it does expose, because I haven't made printed material like that for a long time, and I did think, okay, you know, there are still there's still a really big gap between people who have and don't have, and that actually, I think, you know, I've been refreshed to be mindful about that.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. So the last question I was going to ask you, because I love the fact that we've got boldness and radicality, we've got kindness and empathy, and creativity at the core, and the situation in New York, the situation in London, the situation in Toronto, we're all very different contexts. We're all talking about opening at different times, or not knowing when we're opening. I mean, I should say that we just don't know. And we're all being directed by health experts and medical advice as we do that. So I kind of wanted to ask and so this answer might change depending on the result of all of those of when we might open and how we open. But what are you most looking forward to in relation to your audiences when our buildings reopen?
For me, it's actually learning from them.
Mm.
To really fully understand the impact of this moment in time, and if and how art, or a museum space as the object, as Anna was saying, can actually add value to their lives or their experiences, and what that might be, and if not, and that could be, why, and what should we do about that? I mean, I think a lot about the LaPlaca-Cohen study from 2017 of the broader definition of culture, that, less traditional, street art and, food experiences, that those are how people are defining culture. And, I feel like I'm looking forward to seeing what the teens come up with the second time as well, because I think, how we could reimagine museums to be, could be really interesting. But I think I'm really interested in what we can learn from people.
Thanks. Anna?
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to the conversations, and to not knowing, and that being quite a nice place to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if we can set out with some genuine not knowing, to look at some genuine questions that we really don't know the answers to,
Mm-hmm.
with our publics.
Yep.
And just explore, where we could move to. I mean, nothing has to be the way it is. So what would we like it to be? And I've recently been kind of thinking about, what do we have to change, and what do we want to change, and how does this give us an opportunity to do that? Yeah. Francis Morris suggested that we had a year of questions.
That seems reasonable.
It's a lovely idea. So I think that's where we're heading. We'll have a year of questions.
And it's interesting to think about the ambiguity of this moment, and actually embracing the ambiguity. Like, what we often talk about, that's part of what we do as educators, help people feel comfortable with embracing the ambiguity. So it would seem to come to it with a lot of certainty would be weird. And what I'm finding is, economically, it's actually it's changing the nature of things, like exhibitions are extended longer, there will be no wall changes, all of the things that were entitlements before, and seemed really important, now just can't happen. And so it could actually be a moment where it's like, was that so important? Maybe something else is important. Maybe it'll make space for something else in the future.
I want to thank you both. I know we were slightly fearful in a way that this was going to be not as optimistic a conversation. And actually it has been, because what you've both provided us for is new ways of thinking, new ways of imagining, and nothing has to be the way it is. So I want to thank you both for contributing to a conversation which really opens the doors and opens possibilities for us and those out there that were listening to us. So thank you, Anna. Thank you, Wendy. I hope you stay safe and well, and for everyone that you're friends with and your colleagues the same. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, for doing this.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Always great to talk to all of you.
Yeah, and next week, please tune in. I know our Deputy Director and Chief Curator, Julian Cox, will be in conversation with Asma Naheem, who's the Sylvia Brown Chief Curator from the Baltimore Museum of Art. So the series continues. Please join us, and thank you both again.
Hi.
And thanks to Kathleen and Danny and Annie for making it happen.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Bye.
Bye.